I'm Roy Johnson of the Neutral Zone. So now that we're managing our internal experience of anxiety, we need to talk about how do I manage the external stuff about what's actually going on. The temptation in either of these scenarios, as we talked about, is to go into fight mode or flight mode. But even as I'm now managing that and deciding, okay, I'm not going to lean away from this, I'm not going to go charging into it, instead I'm going to lean into this. How do we do that? Generally speaking, there are two different ranges of strategies that people might employ. A midwife might, in response to the aggressive nurse, might try and model respectful behavior and speaking in a calm tone of voice. Thank you for your perspective. I'm doing the best I can. Let's talk how we can work together. While that can be effective, it tends to backfire. Oftentimes when we're doing that, we're trying to model good, respectful conduct and hoping that they'll join us on that level of communication. It's usually too subtle for a bully. Bullies respect pushback. And if I put myself too disadvantaged in my tone and approach to them, I run the risk of sounding patronizing and condescending, and it's likely going to inflame them further. The second range of approaches that we generally might try is to be very boundary setting, particularly when we're in advocacy mode for the patient. So perhaps in the second scenario, the midwife is now responding to a doctor who's being aggressive in her perception with a patient and wishes to speak up in the patient's defense. You can't touch her like that. You have to practice your bedside manner. She might be seeing herself as setting boundaries or being clear with the physician about the conduct that's expected. However, this too can backfire because now it can look like the midwife is bullying the doctor. And it isn't long before the patient starts to feel like poor doctor and aggressive midwife starts to side with the doctor. And it can make the dynamics complicated. So choosing the right path, both in the moment and a path that supports the relationship moving forward, is challenging. Generally, what I would suggest is that we break that down into two parts. The first part is, what do I do in the moment? They're barking at me, there's energy is high, emotion is high. How do I get through this? And the second part is, once the emotion and the energy has come down, now what do I do to prevent this from happening in the future? Let's look at the first part. It's quite likely that by the time the nurse is barking at the midwife or the doctor's being aggressive with a patient and now the midwife is asserting herself, it's quite likely that all roles there are having an anxiety response. They're all feeling more physiologically aroused than they otherwise would be because it's a stressful situation. Getting through the situation, the strategies we use are a little different than following up afterwards. What I would suggest in the first instance is start off with just a very short acknowledgement, and your tone of voice is going to be key. If you come in too soft with, I can see this is frustrating, you can sound patronizing. If you come in too aggressive, I can see this is frustrating, it can sound like it's escalating. Use a practical tone of voice to acknowledge what they said without agreeing, and here's what it might sound like. We clearly need to get through this. Yep, no, that something clearly didn't work there, let's get this done. Some type of practical commitment to the future without getting into all the things that just happened leading up to this point. Then finish the task. And I appreciate that that's stressful. What I would suggest is that acknowledging allows the other person to know they've been heard. Keep taking deep breaths as you get through the procedure and the task. Now is not the time to be talking about how we're working together, particularly if it's a very critical moment and there might be a life on the line. Then move to the second piece of following up. Once the event is over, once the clinical risk has now been reduced or eliminated, commit to yourself that you will follow up with the other person. Sometimes it's maybe 6 hours later, it might be 24 hours later. I wouldn't leave it longer than a week, you lose momentum. Commit to yourself that you will connect with that person, and this will be a difficult conversation. It's an awkward conversation, it's uncomfortable. But anybody who's ever been to a dentist knows there are plenty of things that are uncomfortable that are also really good for us. And if we get good at having the smaller uncomfortable discussions, we avoid having a really uncomfortable root canal discussion in the future. Approach the person in a timely manner. Try and catch them not too soon after the incident. And try and set up some safety and time and place. Around the nurse's station with tons of activity may not be the best time. You may wish to say to them, may I speak with you just for a moment? I wanted to talk with you about the procedure yesterday. And you may need to take them to a corner of the hallway. That may be as private as you can get. Just try and minimize other people overhearing. And then I would suggest you try the DEAR strategy. DEAR strategy stands for D means describe specifically what you saw and what you heard. It might sound like the other day when we were working together on that procedure, I made an error where I reached for the wrong utensil. And you said something to me like, you're stupid and incompetent. Don't exaggerate, don't generalize. Don't say things like, you're always yelling at me, you're always shouting at me. It's going to make them defensive. Just stay specifically with what you saw and what you heard. E stands for explain the impacts. And here's a trick. If you generally have a good working relationship, talking about your feelings are very good statements of impacts. If I generally work really well with the nurse and we generally have good camaraderie, if I say that it was upsetting and it was hurtful on my end, that's one way to motivate her. But if we don't have a good relationship, if I suspect the nurse is a bully, don't talk about your feelings. Bullies don't care about your feelings. That's why they're bullying you. Instead, talk about an impact that you think is important to them. It might sound like, it made it really hard for me to get through the procedure in the way that you were wanting us to when you use language like that. A stands for ask to hear their point of view. At this point, they generally want to jump in. Let them say it no matter what they say. I might ask a nice open-ended question like, so what was your take on what happened there? And let them say it. You're likely going to hear a totally different perspective against your own. Hear them out, acknowledge their point of view. Oh, okay. They might lie through the teeth. They might say, I didn't say that. Stay curious with them and ask, oh, okay, so what do you remember saying? I said that the way you were doing that was stupid. You hear something that's a little closer to the truth. As quickly as possible, shift to talking about the future. R stands for request. Make a request for the future. Oh, okay, so from your memory, you were talking about the procedure being stupid. Just in the future, it'd be really helpful when we're working together if you don't use words like stupid. See what they say. You're not going to get a firm handshake on that, but you may notice in the future that their behavior changes. I'm Roy Johnson from the Neutral Zone.